You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority.
But the state is still formidable. Or is it?
You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society.
Let's dive headfirst into
The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today I'd like to welcome as my guest Pavel Slutskiy. Pavel, welcome to The White Pill Box.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Excited about this.
Pavel is Associate Professor in Communication Management at the Faculty of Communication Arts, Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, Thailand. I hope I got that right.
Yes,
He
that is right.
holds an associate professorship in public relations and earned his PhD in journalism from Saint-Petersburg State University in Russia. He lives and works in Thailand. He authored Communication and Libertarianism, a book praised by David Gordon of the Mises Institute, and he wrote the follow-up book, Philosophical Foundations of Communication Studies, a Praxeological Approach. And he has an impressive resume in addition to all that, and I'll provide all that in the show notes as well as links to his book. As you know, Pavel, I recently reached out to some of my long-term subscribers, and you expressed your interest in talking about a libertarian take on communication issues, which your books focus on, and I do want to focus on that today in our interview. But first, I would really be curious to know if you can tell us about your own libertarian background, how you got there.
I think it's a bit difficult to remember now. I think I've been a libertarian, or I would consider myself as a libertarian for more than 20 years. And I think I was in my early 20s when I discovered libertarianism. I think it was kind of accidental, as I was trying to find a label that would kind of match my, beliefs or interests or political convictions. I think back then I would self-identify as an individualist, kind of state-skeptical capitalist. And as I was doing my research, I realized that there was actually a name for that, and it was anarcho-capitalism or libertarianism. So again, it was a matter of research, basically, whether there was an ideology or a philosophy that would kind of match my intuitions, and then I came across it. So I think I started with Murray Rothbard. Again, yes. Ethics of Liberty was again, as for many people, this was the case. I think I actually read that one even before the Libertarian Manifesto. And then it kind of clicked, and from there it was like the traditional way, Mises and Kinsella and Hopper, so
Wow.
all your regular
That's a
suspects.
wonderful journey. And like you say, that's fairly common. My own was Rothbard and Ayn Rand and that general group. Did you, were you in Thailand at that time?
No, back then I was still in Russia. So I moved to Thailand about 15 years ago. So I was already in my mid-30s. So I think I became a libertarian like way before that. And I actually have about 2 books in Russian on similar topics. Again, they're obviously not as, I wouldn't say that my books in English are particularly influential, but at least they've been noticed. My books in Russian, they kind of went not so noticed, but it's fine. So yes, I've been writing about libertarianism, again, mainly from the communication perspective for, let me think, almost 20 years now, yes.
That seems to be something that you've really, really, truly focused on, and I am very curious about that because those are 2 topics that to me don't necessarily seem to intersect perfectly. Not that they contradict, but I just never thought of them. Could you give us first an overview of that intersection?
Well, again, I was trained as a communication scholar specialist, and then my PhD was in political science, so it's journalism, political science. And I became interested initially in, let's say, implications of libertarian political ideology for communication. Let's say the chapter in Rothbard said the ethics of liberty on free speech and how free speech are the extension of property rights and all the follow-ups on that. And then I got more interested in the connection between communication and libertarianism, because again, communication is generally non-invasive, it's non-aggressive, right? So, and it seems like, as far as, Chinwag goes, like anything goes. But then the more you start thinking about it, the more you realize that it's actually slightly more complicated complicated than that. Again, actually I can talk about it for a long time, but the easiest example would be threats, right? So your traditional definition of non-aggression principle would kind of prohibit the initiation of force or a threat of thereof, right? But threats, it's just talking. Right? So words can't hurt. So why do we prohibit it, right? Or, for example, contracts, right? Contracts are also words, again, written or spoken. Again, why are they enforceable? Because in most cases, we would think, even if you take the Rothbardian/Kinsella kind of title transfer theory of contracts, well, these are still words, again, either written or spoken. But then we think that once the title has been effectively transferred, some legal normative consequences would follow, and there's enforceable consequences. How come? Right? So how come do we think that force is permissible in response to, again, non-aggressive action, which is just chinwag? So I was interested in this, and I started thinking about that. Again, another fundamental concept for libertarianism, the concept of consent, right? So again, many have written about this, how kinesthetically a boxing match is identical to assault, or passionate sex is similar to rape, and the only difference is consent, right? What actually separates this, impermissible aggressive action from perfectly consensual? And of course, consent is also communication, right? So communication is actually what allows us to identify aggression and non-aggression. And then some other things which are related to that. And I think my, again, contribution, if I can say so, to this is that I made this attempt to kind of link libertarian theory and speech act theory, which is part of language philosophy, the philosophy of language and pragmatics, which identifies the difference between constitutive speech acts and performative speech acts. Speech that actually does things, like how we can use speech to do things, like how we do things with words, as Austin famously said. So I thought that there's some interesting parallels between these two philosophies, and the more I was digging into this, the more I was discovering. So that became interesting, and then I wrote these two books about it.
That then leads to the, I think it's chapter 3 of your book, which that rose to the top for me. I don't know, not sure why, but you call it Communication, the Importance of Terminology, and then several of your first sections of that is purpose, intention, and knowledge as necessary elements of communication. To me, that strikes me as key. Could you touch on purpose as a element of a necessary element of communication?
Again, it's about placing communication in this wider framework of praxeology as the study of human action. And again, some praxeologists, even Hoppe, would argue that there are like actions, and actions usually would deal with material things, like making some changes in materialistic world of molecules and atoms. And again, that would be different from communication. My perspective is slightly different. Again, maybe I'm misunderstanding or misinterpreting Hoppe, but I think that communication is also subcategory of human action. It belongs to this wider category of human action, in a sense that this is what we do in order to achieve our desired aims in social world by influencing cognitive states of other social actors, right? And that's purposeful, right? It's a purposeful action in a sense that it kind of fits squarely within the traditional Misesian kind of definition of action, like conscious aiming at ends. Right, and then the ends are, of course, like what we want to achieve in terms of changing those statuses of other people's mental states, right? And then the means that we use are the means of communication. And then as you start thinking about these means and what they are, then you again come with different ideas. And my main idea is that the central tool, like in this toolbox, will be conventions and common knowledge. And these conventions, they come in different shapes and forms. For example, we have a convention of a contract, or we have a convention of homesteading, or we have a convention of other things. That's a marriage ceremony. So you say I do, and these are words, but then after saying these words, suddenly you realize that, in case if you get divorced, you lose half of your net worth, right? So obviously these words, in most social circumstances, due to some common knowledge, background conditions, they create these normative consequences. So these are not just words, these are actions.
Interesting. So really actions then, or words or communication in general, is part and parcel of the causal links between our initial intention to do something, act, and empirical and tangible results in the world. So, for example, an act of aggression, that let's assume it was intentional, is birthed, in a sense, in this initial mental intention to act. It expresses itself through a communicative act. Okay, can you tie that in for me, if you will, how communication would work in an act of aggression?
It's not that easy, because communication per se is not necessarily aggressive, or not always aggressive. I would say that in most cases communication is non-aggressive. So, for example, hate speech is of course non-aggression. But at the same time, some types of speech in some contexts, due to those background conditions, can cause aggression or can be considered a shorthand for physical aggression. Again, threats are a good example, and threats are absolutely fascinating. I'm fascinated by threats, by the way. I can talk a little bit more about that if you want. But anyway, why do we think that threats are aggression? Because if the threat is credible, in a sense that it's present and imminent and it's credible, then it warrants the use of force in response, in self-defense. So if I'm threatening to kill you and the threat is clear and present, and if you use force against me to protect yourself, then any court any reasonable judge will let you off the hook, right? Because it's permissible to use aggression against an aggressor. And if I'm making this credible threat, then I will be the aggressor. So if you are again permitted to use force against me, then you can delegate this right to some law enforcement agencies, private or whatever, right? So it means that it's permissible to use force against me because I'm making this threat, right? So that would be an example, right? When some words become aggression, well, by association, right? They're not aggressive by themselves. I'm just using words. And of course, in some contexts, they will be counted as aggression. In some contexts, they are not. So if I'm telling you, you know what, Mark, I really hate your podcast. I'm going to kill you for doing this. Just, stay there. I'll be there in an hour. And of course, you know that I won't be there in an hour because you're like 12 hours away from me or more. Right? So it's going to be a metaphor. So it shouldn't be taken credibly. So if you then, hire a hitman to kill me because you're responding to my threat, that's going to be an unproportional, response to my probably metaphorical threat. So it's a matter of nuances, it's a matter of details in the end, right? So we can't have this kind of armchair, as Kinsella would say, armchair theories about it, right? So it should be probably discussed and decided on this case-by-case basis. But the logic is kind of obvious, right? So some threats, they warrant the use of force in response to them. The question that I'm fascinated by is how much, force or punishment is proportionate or justifiable. Because fundamentally, threats are actually very useful when you think about them. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And why they're useful? Because they give you a clear indication of my intention. So speaking of intentions. So let's say if I threaten you and if I'm telling you, give me your wallet or I will kill you, I give you two very useful pieces of information, which are, again, all about my intentions and what's going to happen if you choose either of these two, horns of the dilemma. Like you can give me a wallet or not. And it's useful because any form of communication facilitates human interaction. Fundamentally, I give you a choice. Like you can, again, consensually, let's put it like this for a moment, give me your wallet and then I will spare you your life. So you will be actually better off compared to the alternative. I could just kill you and then take this wallet, from your dead body. Right? That's always an alternative available to me if I'm making these threats, right? So a threat fundamentally to work has to be palpable and credible. So these are the two things. So one, for my threat to work, you need to actually believe that if you don't comply with my demand, I might actually kill you. But you also need to believe that if you comply and give me your wallet, I won't kill you, right? That's what makes it, powerful. Now, if we want to decide how much we want to punish threats, like to what extent we want to punish them, again, from a consequentialist perspective, we would like to maintain a wide gap between punishing threats and punishing the execution of a threat. Because you want to give me enough incentives not to kill you if you actually comply with my demands. So the punishment for, again, taking your wallet under this threat should be significantly lower compared to actually, killing you and taking your wallet. So which means that threats, again, they should be punishable, of course, but in the interests of victims primarily, we want to kind of maintain the gap, and the gap should be wide enough to incentivize criminals not to follow up with their threats if the victim complies. Because as a criminal, I would be interested in actually killing you because then I get rid of the witness, right? So I should have a really serious incentive to keep you alive. So to me, this is interesting. So the more you think about it, the more you realize that yes, threats are not good, and of course they should be punished, but probably not so much.
Because of that incentive structure. So yes. In today's world, you could say that capital punishment could be, in that sense, could be an too much punishment, because if the next criminal knows he's going to be killed, he's going to go all out and do the worst possible damage.
To get rid of the victim. So let's say if taking your wallet and killing you gives me capital punishment, and threatening to kill and taking your wallet also gives me capital punishment, I'll just kill you. But if it's like, say, capital punishment versus 3 years in prison, well, it's a strong incentive enough for me to take the risk. Right? So it should be something like this. And then, you have all those interesting versions. Let's say, imagine that I'm threatening to kill you and I'm running towards you with a knife, but you have a gun. Well, you can actually kill me, and you will still be off the hook. So I'm actually, like killing me in response to this credible, palpable, whatever, real present threat is justified. But then if, I just take your wallet, keep your life, and then I'm apprehended, well, then perhaps killing me would be too much. The interesting question is, what if I'm threatening you, but then I fail to actually rob you, right? So I'm threatening, but you just, run much faster than I do with my knife because, you're fit and I'm not. And then, I'm apprehended by the police, I'm arrested. So no crime actually, happened, right? There's no victim. There is no purpose for justice to make the victim whole again, because the victim is still whole. The only thing that the victim experienced was some stress and anxiety, but as we know, we can't build legal systems that are designed to protect feelings. We don't have any rights to feel, in any particular way. So what exactly will, the system punish me for if I only made, threats, which is just words? Was there any crime? Again, I just find these questions fascinating.
Okay, so I want to stay on that because that's interesting. So immediately my mind is thinking, well, that may be the first time that person made that kind of threat, in which case it seems like you would not want to be too strong in your punishment, because he could have been drunk, or he could have made a mistake, he could be young. But suppose that he's done that very thing, and that situation is played out 4 times in that neighborhood. Now, I might get a sense as a neighbor or a person who might have been victimized by that I feel like he's a standing threat. I feel like he might do it yet again. And so might there be some kind of action that might want to deal with that concern?
Well, I would say that it's an attempted assault or an attempted robbery, whatever. So I'm not saying that this criminal is completely off the hook. No, I think threats are still punishable. I just think that we should kind of think of it as a minor crime, or a significantly lesser crime than the assault or robbery. Again, the traditional definition of non-aggression principle just doesn't differentiate between aggression and the threat of aggression. They are equally impermissible, and I think it's more nuanced than that. And threats are definitely criminal, and I think they should be criminalized in this kind of ideal libertarian world. But the extent to which they will be punishable, I think it's a slightly more interesting and nuanced kind of question.
It does sound like I was going to say that sounds like that fits squarely into the type of thing that Kinsella has talked about, where in a particular legal system, in a particular territory, they will develop their own norms, legal norms, that over time learn how to deal with these situations based on what that population feels, the culture. Would you expect that, or would you expect a more standardized across, say, the planet? Or
again, yes and no. So I agree with Kinsella that in a libertarian society, different communities, different societies would develop their own norms. But it doesn't mean that all their norms will be aligned with libertarian principles. So you can definitely envision a libertarian society which will be ruled by Sharia law, right, which is distinctly non-libertarian. Well, again, it's going to be built on consensus. Religious people will just, unanimously vote for this. And again, I think libertarian world will kind of allow for that. But this particular fraction of the libertarian world will unlikely be considered libertarian. Right? So just because some communities will allow or accept certain norms doesn't mean that these communities are libertarian, even if they voluntarily accept these norms. Right? So we can have, an imaginable community which is cannibalistic because it's their tradition, and they would all kind of agree on this and think it's fine, to eat foreigners. But we probably will not consider this, part of this libertarian world as, libertarian, because it won't adhere to libertarian principles. So I think we would still need to start thinking from that, again, Grundnorm perspective, like what are those fundamental libertarian rights, and how these rights will be implemented or interpreted, again, on this voluntary basis will depend. And I agree that, that probably different communities and different societies will develop their own interpretations. But some of these interpretations we will still render and accept as libertarian, and some of them probably not.
Yeah, I would think so. One of the examples I came up with, I forgot why I developed the example, but you would have two completely separate communities, and one, let's say, the tradition might be that if you, we'll talk about, let's say, a teenage daughter.
Right.
For an adult to speak to a teenage daughter of a friend is, let's say, against their cultural norms. You don't do that. You sort of go through the father to communicate. And in another more, let's say, Western type of community, it's perfectly okay. So, two men meet on the street. There's a daughter there. It's the first time they meet. They introduce each other. And in one community, when they meet, the person greets the young woman directly. And in the other community, they are not expected to do that. But suppose they do that in that community. This person does speak to the young woman, even though that's against cultural norms. Would you foresee the legal system treat that as some sort of aggressive speech act?
Well, again, that depends. In your particular example, I would think that that's a matter of manners and politeness and etiquette. And again, there's a difference between the norms of etiquette and good manners and customs and traditions on the one hand, and legal norms. Right? Yes, again, manners is something that we want to respect, but we usually don't enforce them legally. Right? So again, that will depend. Right? If that other community which doesn't allow foreigners to speak to females considers this to be a criminal offense, right? So punishable by force. You're stoned to death because you spoke to an unmarried woman without the consent of her father and brothers. Well, that would be one thing, right? If it's a matter of tradition and habits and customs, that's another thing.
Yes, and I agree with you. I do think that whatever the habits and customs and norms would probably be what evolves, and then the legal structure evolves around that. So if the father sees some person speak to the young woman and he punches him in the nose over that, we don't know. We couldn't predict ahead of time whether the legal system would treat that as a crime.
But again, if we continue thinking about actually very interesting example. Let's say, imagine that I belong to that traditional kind of community where speaking to my daughter, I have a daughter, so it's relevant, is not permissible. And then I punch you in the face for speaking to my daughter without my consent. The question is, who initiated aggression?
You're right.
I would say that in this libertarian world, I would be, initiating aggression in response to a non-aggressive action. So I will be the one who would be considered, the first to start using force. And again, I think that if we go to, let's say, this imaginary third-party independent, judge to resolve our dispute, he would probably rule in your favor, right? Because your action may be inappropriate, maybe unacceptable, was still non-aggressive. And my response was out of proportion. I could, use maybe some slurs. I could have offended you. I could, argue with you. I could bring it to your attention. I could shame you. But using physical force perhaps would be considered as an act of initiating aggression. Mm-hmm. Because no matter how we treat it, again, how inappropriate or unacceptable your behavior was, I don't think that, any legal system or any legal logic would interpret your behavior as a shorthand of aggression. Mm. It would be a violation of some, social norms, perhaps, but not aggression. Yeah, again, we can easily think of examples when speech aggresses, right? Again, I think Bloch gives these examples, and Kinsella also talks about it, like, let's say, using other parties. You give orders as a military officer or as a general, and you give orders to bomb. Well, these are not just words. Due to the nature of the relationship between me as a superior and my soldiers under my command, my orders are more than just words. So I will be responsible for their actions. Right? So in this case, my words, like go and bomb this city or go invade this country. Right? So if I give these orders, right, so these would be counted as an act of initiating aggression, for sure. In some cases, I don't know, fraudulent advertising, right? So I advertise, one thing, and then I defraud you by actually delivering you something else. I take your money, so that would be considered as theft by fraud, right? Again, it's a longer conversation, but again, as an example. So in this case, the action of defrauding you would be equivalent to theft, although the only thing that I did actually lied, right? So in this case, my lies would warrant some kind of use of force for restitution or compensation or whatever. Right? So I should be punished for lying and defrauding. So my example is that in some cases, just words are more than just words. Right? They create some normative consequences. And in your example, when I spoke to your daughter, I can't think of how my actions, or your actions in your example, speaking to my daughter, violated any rights or initiated aggression. So therefore, any response using force would be not permissible, again, if we follow the logic of libertarianism. And of course, in this perfectly free libertarian world, different communities, different societies can accept their own norms. They can punish whatever they want. It's just that these communities won't be considered strictly libertarian, because they won't be based on libertarian principles.
Exactly. I think you clarified that well there when you said it's based on libertarian principles, because then we could also, like you were starting to say, jump over then to this more traditionalist society, which under the big umbrella, is consent-based, so we could call it libertarian in that very broad sense. But nonetheless, every single person in that community accepts the norm of how offensive it is to talk to the young girl, and if the guy punches him in the nose because of it, the judge may himself be part of that overall norm community where he says, sorry, you were in your rights to punch him, and that's it, because in that particular market framework, that's the kind of justice the community wants, if that makes sense.
Yes and no, because let's say if the judge is kind of completely intellectually honest, he would say something like this: I'm terribly sorry, but in our non-libertarian part of this world, we actually punish those non-aggressive actions by using force against those non-aggressors. Right? So the judge who is aware of the wider, legal order of this libertarian world and being intellectually honest, that's what he would say. You happen to find yourself in an unlibertarian part of this libertarian planet Earth, so here are the consequences. Right? Because again, this part of the world, won't be based on those libertarian principles. So this particular part of their legal code will be unlibertarian because it's going to go against some of those basic libertarian principles, like not to use force against non-aggressors. And this is why, again, libertarian philosophy and libertarian theory is so important. So we actually don't say that everything that people voluntarily agree on is necessarily libertarian. No, again, things have to be, I believe, somewhat aligned with those basic fundamental principles of, again, rights and liberties. Because people can agree on whatever, and maybe voluntarily agree on these things, but these things will not be libertarian.
Right. Yeah, I could totally see that.
They will be voluntary, they will be, consensual, and nonetheless non-libertarian.
Yes. It's wonderful speculation. You said something that triggered another thought in my mind regarding a scenario where there's an attempted murder that fails. So someone puts a bomb, let's say, whatever, in a mail package, and it ends up at the person's doorstep, but for whatever reason somebody opens it, oh look, a bomb, it doesn't actually happen. So here's another case where it's somewhat like a threat, where they didn't actually, it didn't result in an actual harm or victim, unless you count the stress, and yet it does seem much more serious than an idle threat.
And again, there's a huge difference, because in the case of your planted bomb, there was an attempt to use force. So the action, executed, was an attempt to use physical force or trespass or violation or whatever, use of aggression. With the threat, it's a failed threat. Like the threat failed. So what failed is not like an explosion. What failed is that your attempt to perform a particular act of speech, you threatened successfully, so that you would actually extort, some assets of value. That's what failed. You didn't fail at actually successfully executing the threat. So it's not that the victim didn't comply, then you wanted to stab the victim with the knife, but then the knife broke. That's not the case, right? What failed was that the speech act failed. Like the person wasn't threatened, he just laughed at your face, whatever, turned his back and walked away because, you didn't look scary enough, right? I don't know, have you watched this movie? I just saw another kind of short clip from it, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Tarantino.
Yes, I have seen that, I believe.
So remember this scene, like when the murderers come to Brad Pitt's house, and he just laughs at them and says, "Are you guys serious?" Right? And he just laughs it off. He doesn't take those threats, seriously. And then he just, orders his dog to attack them, and the dog, just tears them to pieces, right? So and that's it. Okay, yes, he responded to these threats with force, but fundamentally he just, laughed it off. So if this happens, it's not that the attempt to use force failed, the speech act failed. So the person, you're again, if we think about praxeologically, the purpose of the threat is to threaten, right? So that you would comply. And if you're not scared, if I fail to threaten you successfully because you don't believe that I'm capable of executing, so you just you're not threatened. This is what failed. My attempt to kind of create a particular sensation or particular mental response or cognitive state in you, this is what failed. Right? The speech failed. And since speech is non-aggressive in nature, then what exactly do we punish? A failed attempt to make you scared? Can we protect people from failed attempts to make them scared? Is it libertarian or not?
Right. And yet, I want to flip back then to the failed side or the idle side. So, all right, we'll take this. I love this one. A human being is walking down the street, and he's brandishing what appears to be a gun, and he is threatening to shoot it at any bystander that he sees. Now, I'm going to split this off into two scenarios. One, the human being is actually 5 years old, and the gun is a toy gun. And the other, the human being is 45 years old, absolutely, clearly drunk, and known to carry loaded weapons. So obviously we have two quite different scenarios. With the child, clearly it fits into the situation you just mentioned. It's a threat that is essentially an idle threat. Nobody would imagine that could be executed, and therefore we can essentially laugh at it, and therefore under libertarian theory it's utterly not punishable. And in the other, that's the one I want you to comment about. How seriously do you take that threat when no actual harm has happened yet?
Well, that goes back to the initial discussion. That's where I began this interesting topic. So the threat has to be palpable, which is again present, clear, real. I call it palpable. So you have reasons to believe that it can be executed. So again, we're talking about future, so it's always a contemplation, it's always guessing, right? It's always about prediction and forecasting. Like, is this possible to happen? So again, let's say, imagine that you see this 45 drunk, known for being abusive and aggressive, and he's running around with something that looks like a gun, and then you think that this is a danger, and then you decide to protect your community, your family, whatever. You pull out your real gun, and then you shoot him, right? And then obviously you're taken to court by his family, and then you are accused of initiating aggression against a non-aggressor who was just walking around with a wooden toy gun. And then the judge will look at some CCTV video footage, and he would say, well, you were actually probably correct in interpreting this behavior as a clear and present danger and as a palpable threat. So in this case, he might be, very likely to let you go, and you're off the hook, right? Because your interpretation of this particular speech was correct, and that goes back to again my wider framework that speech only acquires its meaning due to the existence of some common knowledge background conditions, like what things actually mean in our community. Right? So if in our community a guy drunk is running around with guns or something that looks like guns and is threatening, kill people, well, in this community we, treat it as, as an attempted assault or an attempted crime, and then we respond to this by, resorting to self-defense. In some other circumstances, let's say you are in Hollywood and there's a movie set and there's a drunk guy in a cowboy suit running around with a revolver. So again, it should be understood that this is a movie and probably it's on set, and shooting him would be not justifiable, right? So that's, again, I forgot who used this example. Maybe Kinsella, maybe Rothbard. But again, that depends on many things. And a lot of our speech and speech acts and performatives, they acquire their meaning and their normative power due to the existing normative conditions. Again, these are background conditions. Right? So, and again, what things would mean will depend on the conventions within a given community. So what exactly would count as consent? Depends what we as a community, as a society, agree is consent. Just like these days in your lovely country, people actually record videos of girls, consenting to having sex so that they would later have, a proof, evidence. And in some cases, she can just, nod or give you a kiss, and that would count as consent. Depends on how we treat things. What will count as, as an enforceable contract, like property title transfer. Again, when I'm ordering a cup of coffee in a cafe, I don't sign anything. I'm just making an order. But if I say one cappuccino, please, I put myself under some legal obligations to pay for this cappuccino. Right? And if I don't, the waiter can call the police. I didn't sign anything, right? But in our community, in a civilized place, if you're placing an order in a restaurant, well, then by doing that, you successfully impose some normative legal obligations to pay for the dinner. You can't just say, "Oh, this is just words, I don't owe you anything." No, you do, right? And then let's think of some other examples. Let's say if you go to Bulgaria, which is a lovely place, well, this means yes, as you may know.
Really?
So yes, so their non-verbal language is kind of reversed. So this would mean yes. In India, this would mean yes, right? So let's say you go to, I don't know, you can imagine how this can create a lot of misunderstanding. Right? So you go to Bulgaria and you are in a cafe and the waiter asks you, "Would you like to have another coffee?" You're not confident in your Bulgarian, so you decide to resort to non-verbal communication. So you do this: he brings you another coffee, right? Because in his language you said yes, you gave your consent, right? So do you have to pay for it? Who is right? Who is wrong?
Yeah, exactly.
But obviously, the occurrence of that normative obligation has been created by the fact that there are some pre-existing conventions about, in this case, non-verbal communication. Obviously, this case would be a case of misunderstanding, but whether this means, yes, I'll pay for it, or if it means, no, I'm not going to pay for this, depends exactly on that. So the conventions within the community, they give power for the language, for the communication to create those normative consequences.
Mm-hmm. Now, before you talked about us probably not wanting to over-punish an unsuccessful or a threat that did not materialize, I want to flip to the opposite side of that. And could punishment be too lenient so that they are incentivized to keep threatening even though those threats may not materialize? So shouldn't some form of punishment emerge even if it's minimal?
I think so. Again, I think it will still be permissible to punish threateners. And again, that permission would come from this logic, because you are, again, permitted to use force in self-defense. That would make the use of force permissible and justifiable or justified. Okay? So if the threat is credible enough to warrant self-defense, that means that this kind of threat deserves to be punished by force. So the act of threatening to the point that self-defense is justified creates that sort of, normative consequences that you can actually be punished for doing it. So once the use of force is justifiable, well, that means it's punishable.
Right. So you can concoct a situation where somebody a very large person threatens someone who's very small, or that's their habit. Let's say he's a bully. He's just a bully, and he uses only speech acts to threaten and intimidate, but there's never any actual, you might say, harm, except perhaps for the feeling of stress the person feels, but he never goes through with it. But he does this repeatedly in a neighborhood, repeatedly in a community. I wonder sometimes if it's a combination of perhaps of legal norms, but also simply community norms. In other words, people might just say, let's walk over to that guy's house and sit down with him. Let's try to talk to him and try to figure out why he does this. I mean, shouldn't it, I would think, start that way and then only escalate if necessary?
Well, again, if he only walks around threatening, but actually never follows up, never executes any of those threats, I think that your response would be probably a more logical starting point. And I think, it's one of those interesting examples where we need to kind of combine two logics. So the logic of rights, right? So like, what are the rights? And the rights are by definition things that we should be allowed to protect using force, right? Because if you can't use force to protect your rights, these are not rights at all. And in this sense, using self-defense against a threatener is a right, right? So if I'm running around with a knife and you think that the threat is real and present, then you're justified in using force against me. And that's the rights-based logic. Now, another logic is how much we will need to punish those threats if they're not being executed, if the threatener hasn't followed up. And I think in this case, our rights-based logic should be kind of tuned down. Imagine that it's like an equalizer and a mixer, and then the consequentialist logic will kind of kick in, right? So how we're going to balance those different types of incentives? So we definitely want to deter threateners from making these threats, because clearly, it's a problem for social interactions. It's just not good. So we definitely want to discourage this behavior. But at the same time, we want to give them, or those criminals or potential criminals, we want to give them incentives good enough not to proceed with the threat execution. Right. So these are kind of two ways of thinking. Yes, we need to punish them. It's fine. It's justified to punish those threateners. But how much? Well, enough to deter those who are just mild threateners, and enough to give them good enough incentives not to proceed with the execution of the threat. And so again, that I think will depend, right? Like, in some communities you will need to be, stricter and harsher with those punishments. In some communities, probably not. It depends on how criminal your area is and how big the problem is, and many other things. So that I think will be exactly as we've been discussing, kind of determined on a case-by-case basis, both individual and community. But of course, communities would need to set expectations, right? So again, the Badman theory of law suggests that the law is just a set of predictions for people who don't care about ethics, like what's going to happen to them if they do that or that. Right? So like the law needs to give those clear expectations. If I threaten and I don't execute the threat, then I'll get 1 year in prison. If I threaten and I execute, then I get 10, 20 years in prison or capital punishment.
Right.
So, and that's important.
Yes. I'm fascinated about how cause and effect plays into all this. So in your example before, or you might have been, not your example, but related would be a firing squad, right, where the chief says fire and they all fire. And there's some interpretations of that say only the leader is responsible because he yelled fire. Others say, no, he's utterly unresponsible, but only the people who fired are responsible. But I don't see why you can't just have a multiple locus of cause and effect where all carry some form of responsibility. How do you weigh in on that?
Well, again, I think it depends. Again, depends on the nature of the relationship between the firing squad commander and the soldiers, and the nature of the obligations. I definitely can't see any situation where this commander is off the hook just because he only yelled and other, pulled the trigger. So if the nature of their relationship puts him in the position where he can expect his authority to be accepted and respected, and he expects that others are going to follow through and execute his orders, so that ultimately makes him responsible. The extent to which the subordinates had their own, free will, the extent to which they were free or had the ability to defy the orders, right? I think it depends. I don't think that they're ultimately not going to be responsible for any consequences at all is also kind of preposterous. So I think we should treat individuals as autonomous moral agents who are ultimately responsible for their actions. Again, probably in some cases they will be less responsible because they were just following orders. But I think the Nuremberg, process kind of gave us enough of that, logic. Like, who were those Nazis who were just following orders, and who were those Nazis who were giving these orders, and so on. So, that has been discussed at length.
Yes. I think Kinsella brought up the concept of there's no one single quantity of responsibility that has to be divvied up.
It's a dividable puzzle for sure.
Yes, exactly right. Where does intent fall in this? Now you have wings of the movement, the libertarian thinking, that doesn't regard intent as relevant whatsoever. In other words, if a pure accident happens where I'm the victim of an accident, but my accident causes another person to also be harmed, where I had no intent in there at all. A rock falls on me and my body slams into another person. I'm a victim of circumstance. But some regard that as an act of aggression because my body, aggressed against another, even though there was an intent there. And another group in the libertarian movement says, no, there has to be intent there, a causal intent. I'm very curious about your thoughts on this.
I think Bloch did really good job at addressing this. So again, and I think it also kind of fits squarely within the praxeological definition of action. So for something to be considered an action, there has to be an aim, there has to be an intent. But obviously not everything that happens and not everything that humans do is intentional. Right? Again, you can do things by accident. And Bloch gives this wonderful example. I'm sitting in my home and I'm cleaning my gun, which I always do on Sundays. And then accidentally, because it's such a schmuck, I was really clumsy, and I wasn't careful enough, and the gun fires, and I shoot your TV, which is in your home, in your house, living room, across the street. Never, in my life did I mean to do it. It was purely accidental, so it wasn't intentional. But of course I'm responsible for this. So as a good neighbor, I will come to you and say, hey, I'm terribly sorry, my fault entirely, let me kind of compensate, right? So that's a regular thing. So even if your actions, okay, these are not actions, right? So they don't qualify as action, praxeologically, but it doesn't mean that you're not responsible for the consequences, right? If you do something like this intentionally, there would be also a criminal component to this, right? In this case, it doesn't constitute any crime. Right, it's just an accident, you were clumsy, but you're still responsible for the damages. And I think, again, a lot of that logic is also applicable to speech, right? So you never meant to say that. You never meant to give your consent by, waving your head like this and agree to this cup of coffee. It happened by accident. Maybe you had some neurological condition that makes your head goes like this. But the waiter doesn't know that you have this condition, that your head just shakes because you have Alzheimer or whatever. And he interprets it as a concern that you want another beer, right? So accidentally, you gave rise to those normative obligations to pay for that beer. Right? You never wanted to, but that happened. So how are we going to deal with these cases? So again, I think that some of those unintentional, let's call them activities, behaviors, can create normative consequences. You might be responsible for these consequences. It's just going to be pointless to try to analyze them within the praxeological framework of action, because these are not actions. So they're just things that happen, and we can attribute responsibility for them, and that's okay. But just thinking about them in terms of, the actor had some intentions, and then the actor consciously utilized some means, and so on, that's going to be pointless.
And I agree with that, actually. But when that part of the movement who disregard intent, who don't regard that as important, talk about it, they'll often talk about it purely from the victim standpoint. So they're basically saying, look, the victim was victimized regardless of whether the person intended it or not. And in fact, look how difficult it is for a arbitrator or a judge to get into the head of the actor to really determine if they were intentional or not in that act. And I think that's why some of the people who disregard intent feel it's non-objective in that sense. You're looking to the subjectivity of what's in a person's mind.
I think it's a very difficult conversation because, a criminal can always argue that it was accidental, that he didn't mean to fire that gun, it just happened by accident, right? And attempt to reduce the amount of punishment, that he inflicts upon himself. And I think it's always a big question. I don't have a good answer for this, honestly. Again, I was usually thinking about this in terms of, our communication phenomena. And as we were thinking about the meaning of actions, and I think when you're trying to understand what actually happened and what was the meaning of action, or the meaning of an utterance, I think that the true meaning of any action is the meaning that the actor had, like the intention that the actor had in mind. And I like John Searle a lot, who is not really a libertarian philosopher, but still an important philosopher. And he talked about this again at length. So whenever I'm doing something, I'm doing like many things at the same time. So let's say if I'm walking towards my office, I'm moving my feet, I'm waving my arms, I might be looking at my phone, I might be thinking some thoughts, I might be also walking in the general direction of northeast. And for an outside observer, it's not clear what I'm doing. Am I taking just a morning walk, getting my 10,000 steps, or if I'm stretching my limbs, or if I'm going towards the general direction of Patagonia? But I know what I'm doing. I'm walking to my office, right? And I know this because this is the content of the intention that I have in my mind. Now, if we kind of apply this logic to speech, like we have a lot of this when we're arguing about, what was the meaning of a particular utterance, and whether, it was offensive, was it hate speech, was using these words inappropriate, did the speaker intend to inflict some harm or offend and so on. Well, I think the correct meaning of any utterance is the meaning that the actor had. Again, it's our kind of little debate in communication theory and communication studies, like whether meanings are co-constructed by, speakers and listeners, or whether the meanings are the product of the speaker's intention. So I definitely side with the later, that the meaning of any speech, of any text, of any utterance is the speaker's intention. Again, then the speaker can be either successful or unsuccessful, competent or not competent in communicating the intention, and that's going to be based on his skills in utilizing those communicative conventions, language, background conditions, all those things, conventions.
Oh, this is fascinating. I love these topics. There's so many branches and so many tangents that we go
the
down.
Book is thick. The book is quite thick because I think these are fascinating things to talk about. And again, some of my ideas about this are kind of controversial. I also think that homesteading, for example, is a purely communicative thing. Again, I got scolded by other libertarians. I don't think that homesteading is an act of transforming the land, right? I don't think that homesteading or property rights have anything to do with the relationship between a man and the asset. I think it's about the relationship between people about assets. So I don't think that you need to, transform anything with your labor to make it yours. I think all you need to do is just to successfully communicate that it's now claimed to be yours, to make it clear for others that it has been taken. And what exactly you need to do or to say depends on the convention. So my argument is that homesteading and appropriation is an act of communication and not the act of transforming the resource.
I don't know that is even controversial, unless I've not looked into it that deeply. It does seem like, you want to border a tract of land that's been unclaimed. Whatever it is you do has to be communicated in such a way that it is objectively ascertainable by anyone else who might be considering using that property. So it does seem not controversial to me.
It is very controversial. When I published this paper, I got a lot of criticism for that. Again, I think that, appropriation or homesteading by decree will suffice. So if in this community, you stick a flag stick in the sand on the beach and you claim that, 100 miles on this flag post is now successfully appropriated, and if by the convention of this community this counts as enough, that this will suffice, well, then it will.
Yes, right.
So right. If we all read this as enough, then it's enough.
Sure. And And that's why most likely no one would be able to homestead the moon, because there's no real convention that suggests that if I just say I own the moon now, that counts. You wouldn't expect a convention like that to emerge.
Well, we don't know how these conventions will emerge. Maybe they will.
Maybe. Well, we're right at the hour, and I wanted to carve out a little time for you to talk about any projects or any other aspects of your work that you might want to plug and allow me to include in the show notes.
Well, again, I can just say that the books, I think they're quite interesting. Again, if anyone is interested in these topics, again, I can't recommend them because the publisher sells them at ridiculous prices. So that's the reality of academic publishing. Kinsella criticized me for that. He said that I can't be excused for kind of using the publisher to protect my intellectual property. In my defense, I can say that I don't get any royalties, so the publisher gets all the money. I just got my lump sum paid. Again, that's the nature of academic publishing, in case if you don't know. But anyway, I'm always happy to share the work. If you contact me directly, I can send you the chapters that you want to read. And then again, I'm always happy to talk about these things. I believe they're fascinating, and there's a lot to think about. I actually think that communication and libertarianism, these topics are very much connected, and you can see how many aspects, basically almost any facet of libertarian theory, can be explored from the communication perspective, from homesteading to contracts to consent to threats to criminal liability and intent, and a lot of these things actually overlap, to a great extent that we sometimes realize. Blackmail, hate speech, fake news, misinformation, disinformation, property rights in communication assets, and media monopolization. So a lot of these things become more and more important because obviously communication is becoming more and more important for our societies and for our economies. So again, some of these topics are definitely overheated, like fake news, hate speech. But these are also important examples. They have been, I think, thoroughly analyzed by libertarians. I don't think that there is any controversy within the libertarian community about these things. But once again, we usually explore them from the libertarian perspective, and it gives us a distinct kind of position on them, which is also important.
Well, that's exactly right. And it also, I think, helps inform us and remind us that as free societies emerge and as legal norms emerge in a libertarian context, they will find their way organically. They have to, because you cannot predict ahead of time what everyone's going to do and what everyone's intent is. And so I think it should humble us to realize that we can't predict ahead of time, and we should expect, therefore, libertarian orders to work these things out. And I can't see how communication wouldn't be part and parcel to that whole framework.
Absolutely, because the only way these conventions can function is through some kind of negotiation. Again, we would need to kind of find an argumentative way to talk about these issues, voice positions and negotiate them. And hopefully, it can be either done peacefully, and peaceful negotiation requires communication, or because the only alternative to communication, voluntary communication, is the use of force, aggression. So it's either we talk about things or it might make strike. Right? So the exact opposite. So fundamentally, communicative approach and communication as a way of interacting with each other is the only alternative to aggression. How else do we collaborate? How else do we coexist? So we either do it peacefully, that means that we talk about things, or we either don't talk to each other, we don't work together, we don't collaborate, we don't associate, or we do it using force. So these are the three alternatives. We either use force, or we don't associate, or we actually communicate. That's it. I don't see any other alternatives.
I agree. Well, that's really a wonderful place to wrap up, because it's we land on peace and cooperation, and that's really what this is all about. Pavel Slutskiy, thank you so much for joining me today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you.
And folks, be sure to check out the show notes. I'm going to link to Pavel's work, and for more information about him, he's a very interesting person. You do want to read up on him. And as always, thank you to everyone out there who joined us today. Take care, and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.